Here we will draw the pathways through the cerebellar peduncles, the corticopontocerebellar pathway, and the cerebellar midline structures and arterial supply. We begin with the general organization of inflow and outflow through the cerebellar peduncles. Label the cerebellum, then draw the middle cerebellar pathway, MCP, inferior cerebellar pathway, ICP, and superior cerebellar pathway, SCP. Start a table. Show and notate that the middle cerebellar peduncle is an afferent pathway into the cerebellum. It encompasses fibers that originate from pontine nuclei. Next, indicate that the inferior cerebellar peduncle is also an afferent pathway into the cerebellum. It receives fibers from throughout the brainstem and spinal cord. Now show that the superior cerebellar peduncle sends efferent fibers out of the cerebellum. Note the following major exceptions to the aforementioned rules. The anterior spinocerebellar tract enters the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, which defies this peduncle's role as an outflow pathway. Select midline cerebellar tracts exit the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which defies this peduncle's role as an inflow pathway. Next, list a few key pathways that pass through the cerebellar peduncles. Indicate that the middle cerebellar peduncle comprises corticopontocerebellar fibers, which are critical for the modulation of movement. Key fiber tracts of the inferior cerebellar peduncle include the spinocerebellar tracts and the olivocerebellar fibers known as climbing fibers. In short, in regards to the inflow-outflow traffic of the cerebellum, the main inflow pathways into the cerebellum are the middle and inferior cerebellar peduncles, and the main outflow peduncle from the cerebellum is the superior cerebellar peduncle. Next, let's draw the corticopontocerebellar pathway. Indicate that the clinical application of this pathway comes in the analysis of cerebellar deficits. Cerebellar injuries cause ipsilateral deficits. If a person has a cerebellar deficit due to brainstem injury, then either the ipsilateral cerebellum or a portion of this pathway is affected. If the area of injury localizes contralateral to the side of the body that is affected, think of a corticopontocerebellar pathway lesion. Draw one side of the brain and then the opposite side of the cerebellum. Label the midline of the diagram. Indicate that the bulk of the pathway originates in the primary motor and sensory cortices. We exclude the lesser contributions from more wide-reaching brain regions. Now show that the corticopontocerebellar fibers first descend to the pontine nuclei, where they make their primary synapse. Next, draw the middle cerebellar peduncle and show that the pontine nuclei project across midline through the middle cerebellar peduncle into the contralateral cerebellar cortex. Then show that the cerebellar cortex projects to the dentate nucleus, which lies deep within the cerebellum. Indicate that the dentate projects fibers out of the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, which cross midline within the midbrain, inferior to the red nucleus, to synapse in the ventrolateral nucleus of the thalamus, and also in the red nucleus. Now show that the thalamus projects back to the primary motor strip to complete the corticopontocerebellar pathway. This ends our essential material. Now we will draw the anatomy of the anterior cerebellum. Begin with one of the saddle-shaped cerebellar hemispheres. Next, add the cerebellar peduncles, superior, middle, and inferior. Now label the fourth ventricle. Next, in our diagram, include the two components of the flocculonodular lobe. In the hemisphere, show the flocculus, and in the vermis, show the nodule. Now above the fourth ventricle include the lingula, the slender vermian tip of the anterior cerebellar lobe. The lingula combines with the flocculonodular lobe to form the vestibulocerebellum. Next include one of the paired cerebellar tonsils. We include the cerebellar tonsils because this paired midline structure is an important aspect of a common neurologic condition, Chiari malformation. Lastly, let's show the basic arterial supply to the anterior cerebellum. Show that paired vertebral arteries derive the basilar artery, which branches into the paired posterior cerebral arteries. Then indicate that the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries emerge from the vertebral arteries. Next, at the base of the basilar artery, show that paired anterior inferior cerebellar arteries emerge. Finally, at the upper portion of the basilar artery, show that the paired superior cerebellar arteries emerge. Now show that on the anterior surface of the cerebellum, the posterior inferior cerebellar arteries perfuse the inferior cerebellum, the anterior inferior cerebellar arteries perfuse the mid-lateral cerebellum, and the superior cerebellar arteries perfuse the superior cerebellum. This concludes our diagram.